World Denver talks today with Chris Finan, a Silicon Valley entrepreneur working in the area of cybersecurity. Welcome to Denver, Chris.
Great to be here. Thanks, Karen.
First of all, could you define for us what is a cyber threat and explain perhaps for our audience the difference between a cyber threat to national security versus a threat maybe to a company or an industry?
Sure. It's really a threat continuum. We see lower end threats, things like a lone hacker, maybe even a mischievous youngster who might just be experimenting online and trying to see what they can do. So there's things like that are more of a nuisance. And then toward the other end of the continuum, there are nation states who may be actively stealing information at large scale, enormous campaigns to steal intellectual property, trade secrets, economic secrets, and may even be developing the capacity to inflict damage on critical infrastructure systems. That's a very draconian scenario with low probability, but of course high consequences. Sure. And then in the middle of that, we have organized criminal groups, as well as hacking collectives who may be trying to promote a specific cause.
What would you say is our greatest threat? What would be our Pearl Harbor of cybersecurity?
Those low probability, high consequence events, the type of event that could derail a train, cause physical damage and inflict harm to actual people or even financial markets writ large. Those type of events are extraordinarily difficult and take a great deal of sophistication, research, back-end development, and expertise. And so things like that we need to be mindful of, and I think there's an appropriate role for the government to work in partnership with the private sector, critical infrastructure owners and operators to mitigate that type of risk. But again, I think that we have to recognize that those type of national security threats are a very small sliver of cyber threats writ large, and that there's a lot of other things that we can do by just promoting better cybersecurity, ensuring that companies are informing their shareholders and being transparent about material risks to their intellectual property. So there's a lot we can do across our economy and entire society to mitigate the threats.
Do you feel that as a nation we're doing enough to defend ourselves? Are we overreacting? Is the Pentagon just looking for its next big budget item? What's going on in DoD?
We've seen over the last few years that the Department of Homeland Security, other critical infrastructure agencies charged with interacting with their critical infrastructure sectors, these are called sector-specific agencies. For example, the Department of Treasury is charged with interacting with the financial sector. So what we're seeing is a lot of the civilian agencies drawing upon the military's expertise because in the post 9/11 era, our military and intelligence communities have developed incredibly powerful analytics capabilities. Their big data analytics, which we hear the term used a lot, has been really traditionally unmatched. That paradigm is now changing a little bit, where the private sector innovators are becoming very good at this, academic institutions, our national labs. And so where I think in the past we had to, our civilian and homeland defense agencies and law enforcement agencies really needed to tap into that military expertise and intelligence community expertise. That's really changing now. The paradigm is changing where a lot of that type of expertise and those capabilities are now resident in the private sector. And so, my personal view is it's probably time to divest the military and the intelligence community out of our homeland security apparatus and focus those agencies, as traditionally they have been, outward on foreign threats and on preparing to fight overseas.
So the work that you're doing in Silicon Valley is developing some new products in that area, I think.
Consumers want better security. They also, I think, want better privacy. I think we're seeing demand for both security and privacy. And traditionally in our country, we've had both. We've struck a balance. And so I think that's something that, at least out in California, and I think also in DC and other places, people are starting to recognize that perhaps we haven't done a great job balancing the two, and we need to also be mindful of protecting privacy as we develop new security solutions and new security policies.
So do you think that balance is shifting back towards the middle? I think a lot of people would say what NSA has been doing is certainly thrown it to the security at the expense of privacy.
I think I don't condone what Mr. Snowden did. He disclosed classified information which he had committed to protecting and broke the law in so doing. But the fact that some of these programs, especially the ones that have been basically dragnet surveillance programs, have come to light, frankly, I think as a nation is a good thing because we're able to debate it. I think I take issue with the notion that acknowledging the existence of a program at a very abstract, sort of high level will give terrorists our counterterrorism playbook. I think it's possible to talk about things conceptually and help Americans understand what our policymakers feel they need to protect the nation. And in so doing, we should be able to help ensure that balance is being struck, an appropriate balance between some intrusiveness perhaps, while also protecting our Fourth Amendment rights.
But do you think that just sort of sweeping everybody's data into some big data bank is really protecting our security?
I don't know that that's necessary. I personally think that a more targeted approach, it seems like we've used an axe to date. I wonder if there are scalpel approaches that could achieve the same level of threat mitigation. Again, I think these are things that could be debated, and I think, frankly, the government, our law enforcement and homeland security agencies would probably benefit by talking to more academic researchers in the private sector, because really, in the private sector, we have to take into account user desires for privacy as we're developing products, and because of that, we're looking at new techniques. Things like, there's something called homomorphic encryption, for example. Very much still theoretical, but holds the promise of being able to keep data encrypted while still looking at it and still analyzing it and processing it. So you would never actually sacrifice the content, you could still analyze it. So there's a lot of things like that which, if invested in, and if the government really pushed forward, I think could make a huge difference. But I'm not sure that we've had the type of privacy demand signal because many of these programs have been so highly classified.
So secret.
Right.
So do you think if we don't move more towards the scalpel and away from the axe, that we're going to see more young people doing what Edward Snowden did?
Well, I think there's a desire in this country to talk about this issue, to have a conversation about it. Again, I don't condone the disclosure of classified information. Having been an intelligence officer in the military, some of that information is very important and could result in the loss of lives of American troops or even coalition partners who are working with us. So, but in the same vein, I do think we have an overclassification problem. I think that we have a tendency to completely classify things rather than being, again, a little bit more nuanced and only classifying the sources and methods that really matter, and then being able to talk in general terms about high-level concepts. And I think that really comes down to transparency. For example, national security letters, those letters that the government sends to companies. I'd like to know more high-level meta statistics about how many we're sending out, what type of information generically we're seeking to collect or the government's seeking to collect, and the legal justification for that. I don't see how giving out that type of high-level meta information would allow terrorists to evade our surveillance programs.